I need to inspect your bag. You're blacklisted from this airline. Might as well take a sick first. You don't belong here. This section is for premium passengers.
But I have a ticket!
Ma'am, I need you to move, now. The words cut through the air of Gate 47 like a blade. Passengers waiting for Flight 2847 to Atlanta looked up from their phones, their coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips. The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the gray carpeted floor. 72-year-old Margaret Williams stood perfectly still, her weathered brown hands gripping the handle of her small carry-on suitcase. She wore a lavender cardigan her daughter had given her for Christmas, pressed slacks, and sensible walking shoes. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and her reading glasses hung from a delicate gold chain around her neck. "I'm sorry," Margaret's voice was soft, confused. "I don't understand. This is my seat in the waiting area. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. Flight attendant Jessica Hartley towered over the elderly woman, her blue uniform crisp and her blonde hair pulled back so tightly, it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disdain. Her name tag glinted under the terminal lights, and her lips were pressed into a thin line of barely contained irritation. "This section is for our premium passengers only," Jessica said, her voice loud enough that heads turned from 3 gates away. "You need to move to general seating." Margaret glanced around, bewildered. There were no signs indicating premium seating, no ropes, no markers, just rows of identical black chairs bolted to the floor, half of them empty. A young white couple sat 2 seats away, their designer luggage stacked beside them. Nobody had asked them to move. But there's no sign saying. "Are you really going to make this difficult?" Jessica's voice rose sharply. Her hand moved to her hip, fingers splayed in exasperation. "I'm telling you this is premium seating. Do you need me to call security?" The word security hung in the air like a threat. Around them, passengers began whispering. Some pulled out their phones. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, a familiar burning sensation she'd felt too many times in her 72 years. But this time was different. This time, something else flickered in her eyes, something that looked almost like pity for the young woman standing before her. "I'll move," Margaret said quietly, gathering her bag. But Jessica wasn't finished. "Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more." Margaret Williams had been born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1952, in a house with walls so thin you could hear your neighbors' conversations through them. She'd grown up drinking water from colored fountains, attending segregated schools, and watching her mother scrub white women's floors for pennies. But Margaret's mother, Ruth, had possessed an iron will and an unshakable belief that education was the key that would unlock every door her daughter would face. "You're going to be somebody," Ruth would whisper to young Margaret each night, tucking threadbare blankets around her small frame. "You're going to change things." Margaret had won a scholarship to Spelman College, then put herself through night school to earn her MBA while working 3 jobs. She'd raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident, never missing a rent payment, never letting her kids see her cry. She taught them to hold their heads high, to speak with precision and grace, to never let anyone's prejudice define their worth. Her eldest son, Marcus, had absorbed those lessons like a sponge absorbs water. He'd watched his mother wake up at 4 in the morning to study before her shift at the hospital cafeteria. He'd seen her come home with aching feet and still help him with his math homework. He'd witnessed her quiet dignity in the face of 1,000 small cruelties, and he'd vowed that one day he would build a world where his mother never had to bow her head to anyone. Now Margaret lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs of Chicago, though she'd never lost her humble spirit. She volunteered at the community center 3 days a week, teaching financial literacy to young mothers. She sang in her church choir every Sunday. She sent care packages to her grandchildren at college and kept a garden that produced more tomatoes than any one person could eat. She didn't talk much about her son Marcus. When neighbors asked what he did for a living, she'd smile and say, "Oh, he works in aviation." It was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of reality. Marcus called her every Sunday evening at exactly 7 o'clock. He visited once a month without fail, and he'd told her 1,000 times that she could fly anywhere she wanted, anytime she wanted in first class. But Margaret always declined. She'd raised her children to be humble, to never flaunt their blessings. So she bought her own tickets in economy, packed her own sandwiches for the flight, and moved through the world the same way she always had, with quiet grace and dignity. Standing in the airport that day, Margaret had been on her way to her daughter Sandra's house in Atlanta for her granddaughter's graduation. She'd been thinking about the pound cake she'd packed in her checked luggage, hoping it hadn't gotten crushed. She'd been mentally reviewing the speech she'd written for her granddaughter, full of encouragement and love. She hadn't been prepared for Jessica Hartley. Around Margaret, other passengers in the gate area included elderly white couples reading newspapers, a businessman tapping furiously on his laptop, and a young mother trying to soothe a fussy infant. No one else had been asked to move. No one else had been questioned about their right to sit in the public seating area. But as Margaret began to gather her belongings, preparing to relocate as she'd been ordered, Jessica took a step closer. Too close, invading her personal space in a way that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. "And next time," Jessica said, her voice dripping with condescension, "maybe try to dress more appropriately for the airport. This isn't a charity terminal." The words struck like a slap. Margaret looked down at her carefully chosen outfit, the lavender cardigan her daughter had saved up to buy for her, the slacks she'd pressed that morning. She looked back up at Jessica, and for just a moment something flickered across her face. Not anger, something else. Something that looked almost like recognition of a pattern she'd seen too many times before. Margaret picked up her purse and her carry-on suitcase. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply began to move toward another section of seating, her head still held high despite the heat of humiliation burning through her chest. But Jessica wasn't done yet. "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to inspect your bag." Margaret stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face the flight attendant. Around them, the terminal seemed to hold its breath. The businessman had stopped typing. The young mother had paused in her bouncing of the fussy baby. Even the overhead announcements seemed to fade into background noise. "I'm sorry," Margaret said again, that same soft confusion in her voice. Jessica pointed at Margaret's carry-on, a modest black suitcase with wheels that Margaret had owned for 15 years. "Your bag. I need to inspect it. We've had reports of suspicious behavior, and I need to verify you're not carrying anything prohibited." This was a lie, and several passengers knew it. There had been no reports, no alerts, no reason whatsoever for this inspection except the one that Jessica would never say aloud, but that everyone could feel hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. "But I already went through security," Margaret said, her voice still calm but now tinged with something else. Weariness, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd fought this battle in 1,000 different forms across 7 decades. "They checked my bag at the checkpoint. And now I'm checking it again," Jessica snapped. Her hand shot out and grabbed the handle of Margaret's suitcase, yanking it from the elderly woman's grip with enough force that Margaret stumbled forward slightly. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The young mother's eyes widened. The businessman finally looked up from his laptop, his mouth falling open slightly. "Hey, wait a minute," called out a voice from the crowd. It belonged to a middle-aged black man in a business suit who'd been watching the interaction with growing discomfort. "You can't just grab her stuff like that." Jessica whirled on him, her face flushing red. "Sir, if you interfere with airline personnel performing their duties, I will have you removed from this gate and banned from flying on this airline. Is that what you want?" The man fell silent, but he pulled out his phone and began recording. He wasn't the only one. Around the gate area, at least 5 phones were now pointed at Jessica and Margaret, capturing every moment. Jessica unzipped Margaret's carry-on with aggressive, jerky movements. She pulled out the contents one by one, holding each item up as if it were evidence in a criminal trial. A change of clothes, neatly folded. A book about gardening. A small toiletry bag. A sweater. A bag of homemade cookies wrapped in aluminum foil. "What's this?" Jessica demanded, shaking the bag of cookies. "They're cookies," Margaret said quietly. "I baked them for my granddaughter." Jessica tore open the aluminum foil, crumbling several cookies in the process. She examined them suspiciously, as if Margaret might have somehow weaponized her grandmother's secret recipe. Finding nothing, she tossed the ruined cookies back into the suitcase and continued her search. She pulled out Margaret's toiletry bag and dumped the contents onto a nearby chair. Travel-size shampoo, a toothbrush, a small bottle of lotion, medication bottles with Margaret's name clearly printed on the labels. "What are these?" Jessica held up the medication bottles, shaking them accusingly. "Blood pressure medication," Margaret said, her voice beginning to tremble now, not with fear but with the effort of maintaining her composure. "I have a prescription. The labels are right there." Jessica squinted at the labels, clearly disappointed to find them legitimate. She tossed the bottles back carelessly. One rolled off the chair and clattered onto the floor. Margaret bent to retrieve it, her elderly knees protesting, her hands shaking slightly. As Margaret crouched on the floor, reaching for her medication, Jessica took a step closer. And then, whether through deliberate cruelty or careless disregard, she bumped into Margaret with her hip. It wasn't a hard shove. It wasn't violent enough to knock Margaret over completely. But it was enough. Enough to send the 72-year-old woman off balance. Enough to make her reach out instinctively to catch herself. Enough to send her sprawling onto the carpeted floor of Gate 47 while her medication bottles scattered across the ground like marbles. The terminal erupted. "Oh my God," the young mother shrieked. "You pushed her," someone shouted. "I'm calling 911, another voice announced. Jessica's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "I didn't push her," she said loudly, her voice pitched high with defensive panic. "She fell. She's elderly, she just lost her balance. Everyone saw it, right? She just fell." But everyone hadn't just seen her fall. Everyone had seen Jessica bump into her. Everyone had witnessed the casual cruelty that had been building for the past 10 minutes, and everyone's phones were recording. Margaret remained on the floor for a moment, stunned. Her lavender cardigan had twisted around her torso. Her glasses had fallen off and lay inches from her face. Her carefully pinned hair had come partly loose. She looked, for the first time since this ordeal began, like what she was, a 72-year-old woman who had been humiliated and physically mistreated in public. The man in the business suit rushed over, along with 2 other passengers. They helped Margaret to her feet, their hands gentle and their voices full of concern. "Are you okay, ma'am? Do you need medical attention? Someone get a supervisor, now." Margaret straightened slowly, every movement deliberate. She retrieved her glasses and put them back on. She smoothed down her cardigan. She took a deep, steadying breath, and when she looked up at Jessica Hartley, her eyes held something that made the flight attendant take an involuntary step backward. Not anger, not hatred, just a deep, profound sadness and a glimmer of something else. Something that looked almost like pity for what was about to unfold. "Young lady," Margaret said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the now-silent terminal, "you have no idea what you've just done." Within 30 seconds, the gate area had transformed from a typical pre-boarding zone into something that resembled the aftermath of a natural disaster. Passengers crowded around Margaret, asking if she needed water, if she wanted to sit down, if someone should call for paramedics. The young mother had set down her baby in a stroller and was collecting Margaret's scattered belongings from the floor, carefully placing each item back in the suitcase with gentle hands. Jessica stood frozen, her face cycling through expressions so rapidly she looked like she was trying on different masks. Shock, indignation, fear, back to indignation. She seemed to be running calculations in her head, trying to determine the best strategy for damage control. "Everyone needs to calm down," Jessica announced, her voice artificially bright and professional now, as if she could somehow reset the scene and erase the past 15 minutes from existence. "This is being blown completely out of proportion. The passenger lost her balance. I'm trained in safety protocols, and I can assure you all that this was simply an unfortunate accident." "That's not what happened," said the businessman who'd started recording. He held up his phone. I have video of you bumping into her, you pushed her. I did no such thing, Jessica shot back, but her voice cracked slightly on the words. And I'll thank you to stop recording. You're violating privacy policies. We're in a public space, another passenger chimed in, a woman in her 30s with pink streaks in her hair and multiple piercings. There's no expectation of privacy, and I'm recording too, so is he. She pointed to a teenage boy who nodded vigorously. And her. An older white woman with kind eyes gave a thumbs up. We all saw what you did. Jessica's face flushed deep crimson. You people don't understand what it's like to maintain order and safety on these flights. This woman was refusing to follow instructions. She was being difficult. She was making my job harder. I have authority here. I have protocols to follow. What protocol involves pushing a 70-year-old woman? The pink-haired woman demanded. I didn't push anyone. Jessica's voice reached a pitch that made several passengers wince. Why is everyone attacking me? I'm the victim here. Do you know what kind of stress I'm under? Do you know how hard it is to deal with difficult passengers all day, every day? Margaret had finally allowed herself to be guided to a chair. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, watching Jessica's meltdown with that same expression of quiet sadness. One of the helpful passengers had brought her a bottle of water. Another had retrieved all her scattered medications and neatly arranged them in her toiletry bag. Thank you, Margaret said softly to each person who helped. Thank you so much. You're all very kind. Do you want us to call someone for you? The kind-eyed older woman asked, kneeling beside Margaret's chair. Family, friends, the police. Margaret shook her head gently. My son is already on his way, but thank you. This statement seemed to penetrate Jessica's panic spiral. She latched onto it like a drowning person grabbing a life preserver. Your son, she said, her voice dripping with renewed condescension. Well, I'm sure he can pick you up and take you home because you're not flying on this airline today. In fact, I'm going to make sure you're banned from all future flights. Do you understand me? You're blacklisted. A shocked silence fell over the gate area. Even passengers who'd been minding their own business before looked up at this pronouncement. The sheer audacity of it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. You can't do that, the businessman said incredulously. She didn't do anything wrong. You're the one who pushed her. I can do whatever I deem necessary for the safety and security of this airline and its passengers, Jessica declared, her voice now ringing with false authority. She seemed to be growing more confident, perhaps believing that if she just asserted her power loudly enough, reality would bend to match her version of events. And I deem this passenger to be disruptive, combative, and a safety risk. Margaret remained silent. She took a small sip of water. She checked her watch, a simple timepiece with a leather band that her husband had given her 40 years ago. She seemed to be waiting for something, though no one watching could have guessed what. In the corner of the gate area, a gate agent who'd been processing boarding passes for a different flight had witnessed the entire interaction. She was a black woman in her 40s named Patricia, and her hands had started shaking halfway through watching Jessica's treatment of Margaret. Now she pulled out her radio and stepped away from her podium, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the other end. Jessica noticed and marched over to her. What are you doing? Who are you calling? Patricia looked at her with undisguised disgust. I'm calling the airport supervisor and airport security, and I suggest you think very carefully about what you're going to say when they get here. I'll tell them the truth, Jessica said shrilly. That I was doing my job and a passenger became combative and disruptive and fell due to her own carelessness, and now everyone is trying to blame me for it because they're all. She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air like poison gas. Everyone knew what word she'd almost used. Everyone felt it. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they glistened with unshed tears, but not tears of weakness. Tears of a deeper pain, the pain of recognition, the pain of seeing proof that some things never truly change, that the world her mother had fought against still existed, just wearing a different uniform. But there was something else in her expression, too. Something that looked almost like pity for Jessica, as if Margaret could see ahead to the next few hours and knew what was coming. As if she understood that this young woman had just destroyed her own life and didn't even know it yet. Margaret's phone buzzed in her purse. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and allowed herself the smallest smile. A text message in all caps. Landing in 5 minutes. Stay exactly where you are, I'm handling this. She tucked the phone back into her purse and folded her hands in her lap once more. Around her, more passengers had begun to gather, forming a protective semicircle between her and Jessica. They sensed, even if they couldn't articulate it, that they were witnessing something significant, something that would be talked about for years to come, something that would be shown in training videos and discussed in boardrooms and dissected on social media. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed through the terminal. Airport security arrived first, 3 officers in uniform moving with purpose toward Gate 47. Behind them came a man in a suit who carried himself with the bearing of someone important, someone in management. Behind him came more airline staff, their faces already set in expressions of professional concern. And somewhere high above the airport, descending through clouds toward runway 34, a private jet that wasn't scheduled on any public flight board was making its approach. In the cockpit, the pilot had received direct instructions from the owner of the aircraft. Land immediately, taxi to the closest gate, and wait. But Margaret knew something that no one else in that terminal knew yet. The private jet wasn't arriving to rescue her. It had been in the air long before this incident occurred. Her son had been on his way to surprise her, to upgrade her to first class on her commercial flight as a birthday gift, to take her to dinner before she continued on to Atlanta. He'd been planning a happy surprise. Instead, he was about to walk into something that would change everything. For his mother, for Jessica Hartley, for the airline industry itself. But what happened next changed everything. The airport security officers arrived at Gate 47 like a small militia, their boots heavy on the carpet, their expressions professionally neutral but their eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The lead officer, a man in his 50s with gray at his temples and a name tag reading Davidson, surveyed the crowd of passengers, the scattered belongings still being gathered, and the 2 central figures. An elderly black woman sitting calmly in a chair and a flight attendant who looked like she was barely holding herself together. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" Davidson asked, his voice carrying authority without aggression. Jessica lunged forward before anyone else could speak. "Officer, thank God you're here. This passenger has been combative and disruptive. She refused to follow my instructions, she caused a scene, and then she fell and is now trying to blame me for her own clumsiness. She's threatening to sue the airline. I need her removed immediately for the safety of all passengers." The words tumbled out of Jessica's mouth so rapidly they almost blurred together. She was building her narrative, constructing her defense, trying to control the story before anyone else could challenge it. Her hands moved frantically as she spoke, gesturing at Margaret, at the crowd, at the scattered luggage, as if she could somehow arrange the physical evidence to match her version of events. Davidson held up one hand, a gesture that commanded silence. "Ma'am, I need you to take a breath and slow down. Start from the beginning. What exactly happened?" Before Jessica could launch into another frantic explanation, the businessman who'd been recording stepped forward. "Officer, I have video of the entire interaction. This flight attendant harassed this elderly woman, forced her to move from her seat for no reason, dumped out all her belongings in public, and then physically bumped into her hard enough to knock her to the ground." "That's not what happened," Jessica shrieked. "He's lying, they're all lying to protect her." Davidson turned to the businessman. "May I see the video?" Within seconds, Davidson's face had transformed from neutral professionalism to barely suppressed anger. He watched the footage twice, his jaw tightening with each viewing. Then he looked at Margaret, taking in her disheveled appearance, her lavender cardigan still twisted from the fall, the dignified way she held herself despite obvious distress. "Ma'am, are you injured?" he asked Margaret gently. "Do you need medical attention?" "I'm a little shaken," Margaret admitted, her voice soft but clear. "And my hip hurts where I landed, but I don't think anything is broken." "I'm calling for paramedics anyway," Davidson said. He turned to Jessica and his voice dropped several degrees in temperature. "You come with me now." "I'm not going anywhere," Jessica said, but her bravado was cracking like thin ice. I'm on duty. I have a flight to supervise. I have responsibilities. Your responsibilities are suspended as of this moment, said a new voice, sharp and cold as winter wind. The man in the suit had pushed through the crowd, and his face was the color of old snow. His name tag identified him as Robert Chen, Regional Operations Manager. Jessica Hartley, you are removed from duty effective immediately. You will surrender your badge. You will not board that aircraft, and you will accompany these officers to the security office where you will provide a full statement about your conduct. Jessica's face went through another rapid transformation. The color drained from her cheeks. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted around the crowd as if looking for allies, but found only condemning stares and phone cameras still recording her every movement. You can't do this to me, she whispered. I've worked here for 8 years. I've never had a complaint. I've followed every protocol. I was just doing my job. Your job does not involve harassing passengers, Chen said, his voice cutting through her protests like scissors through tissue paper. Your job does not involve racial profiling. Your job does not involve dumping an elderly woman's belongings in public. And your job absolutely does not involve physical contact that results in a passenger being knocked to the ground. The words racial profiling seemed to hit Jessica like a physical blow. I didn't, that's not what this was about. I don't see color, I treat everyone the same. Ma'am, Patricia, the gate agent who'd called this in, stepped forward with her phone held out. I have your Facebook page open right here, the one where you posted yesterday about how certain people shouldn't be allowed to fly because they bring down the whole experience. The post you made last month about how you're tired of dealing with difficult passengers who don't appreciate the privilege of air travel. The comment you made on your friend's post about how airlines should have stricter screening for people who clearly can't afford to fly. The blood drained from Jessica's face so rapidly she looked like she might faint. Around the gate area, passengers gasped. Phones that had lowered were raised again, capturing this new revelation. Those posts are private, Jessica stammered. You had no right to. Your privacy settings say otherwise, Patricia said coldly. Everything was public, including the photos of you and your friends at that rally last year wearing shirts with slogans I won't repeat in mixed company. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the airport announcement seemed to pause. Margaret watched this unfold with that same expression of profound sadness, as if she'd seen this movie too many times before and knew exactly how it ended. Chen's face had gone from white to red. Get her out of my sight, he said to the security officers, and someone get legal on the phone, now. As 2 officers moved to escort Jessica away, she seemed to crack completely. The professional facade shattered like dropped glass. This isn't fair, she wailed. You're all ganging up on me. I'm the real victim here. That woman probably planned this whole thing. She's probably a professional victim who goes around looking for reasons to sue airlines. Did anyone think of that? Did anyone consider that maybe she's the one who's lying? The man in the business suit who'd recorded everything spoke up again, his voice steady and cold. I'm an attorney. I practice civil rights law, and what I just witnessed and recorded is one of the clearest cases of discrimination and assault I've seen in 20 years of practice. Ma'am, he turned to Margaret, if you need representation, I'm offering my services pro bono. In fact, I'd be honored to take your case. Margaret smiled at him gently. That's very kind of you, but I think my son's legal team will have this covered. Your son's legal team? Jessica latched onto this with desperate mockery. What, does he know a lawyer? Does he have a friend who went to community college for paralegal studies? That's not going to help you. You're nobody. You're nothing. You think you can take on an airline? You think anyone will care about you? The words hung in the air like a curse. Several passengers looked away, unable to watch this meltdown continue. Others recorded every word, knowing instinctively that this footage would matter. Margaret simply checked her watch again and smiled. Because somewhere in the airport, moving through customs with expedited clearance, walking through corridors that most passengers never see, escorted by airport officials who'd scrambled to attention the moment his plane had landed, came Marcus Williams. And he'd heard every word. Marcus Williams stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, with his mother's eyes and his late father's broad shoulders. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that cost more than some people's cars, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd built an empire from nothing and knew his worth to the penny. His shoes clicked on the polished airport floor with rhythmic precision. Behind him walked three people: his executive assistant carrying a tablet, his head of legal affairs with a briefcase, and the airport director who'd met him personally at the private terminal. But despite the entourage and the expensive clothes and the obvious importance, the first thing anyone noticed about Marcus Williams was his face. Because his face, at that moment, showed a level of controlled fury that made grown men step aside. He'd received the alert from airport security 6 minutes after his plane had landed. Someone had assaulted a passenger named Margaret Williams at Gate 47. His mother, who'd raised him and his siblings with nothing but love and sacrifice. His mother, who'd taught him that dignity wasn't something anyone could take away unless you let them. His mother, who was sitting in an airport terminal being harassed by someone who worked for his airline. His airline. Because Marcus Williams wasn't just a man in aviation. He wasn't just someone who worked with planes. Marcus Williams was the founder, CEO, and majority owner of Skybridge Airlines, the fastest-growing airline in North America, with a fleet of 140 aircraft, routes to 63 countries, and annual revenues exceeding $12 billion. And he was about to walk into Gate 47. The crowd saw him before Jessica did. Passengers who'd been recording the incident shifted their phones, capturing the arrival of this new figure. Patricia, the gate agent, straightened immediately, her eyes widening in recognition. Robert Chen, the regional operations manager, went pale and then red, then pale again. "Mr. Williams," Chen stammered, stepping forward. "Sir, I didn't know you were. We weren't informed that you'd be, sir. I can explain." Marcus held up one hand without looking at him. His eyes were locked on his mother, who still sat in that chair with her lavender cardigan twisted and her belongings scattered around her like debris from a shipwreck. He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the word. He knelt beside her chair, his expensive suit pants touching the airport carpet without hesitation. His hands, so large compared to hers, took her small, weathered hands gently. "Mom, are you hurt? Did they hurt you?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled at her son. "I'm okay, baby, just a little shaken up, but I'm okay now that you're here." Marcus's jaw clenched. He stood slowly, turning to face the crowd. His gaze swept across every face, taking in every detail, and when his eyes landed on Jessica Hartley, she actually took a step backward. "Someone tell me," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the now-silent terminal, "exactly what happened to my mother." The businessman with the video stepped forward immediately. "Sir, I have everything recorded. This flight attendant targeted your mother from the moment she saw her, forced her to move from her seat, dumped her belongings, inspected her bag without cause, and then physically knocked her to the ground." "She fell," Jessica whispered, but her voice had no strength left. "She just fell. It was an accident." Marcus turned to her slowly, and the look on his face made her take another step back. "What's your name?" Jessica Hartley." "Jessica Hartley," Marcus repeated, as if tasting the words. "How long have you worked for Skybridge Airlines?" 8 years, she whispered. Then with a flicker of desperate hope, "I've been a model employee. I've never had complaints. Ask anyone. Ask Mr. Chen. He can tell you." "Mr. Chen," Marcus said, still not looking away from Jessica. "How long have we had complaints about Ms. Hartley?" Chen shuffled papers he'd pulled from his tablet, his hands shaking. "Sir, we have 17 complaints filed over the past 3 years, mostly involving passengers of color. Several mentioned aggressive behavior. 2 mentioned inappropriate comments. All were classified as resolved through coaching." "Resolved through coaching," Marcus repeated flatly. "And yet here we are, with my mother on the floor of my airport in my terminal after being assaulted by my employee." He finally looked at Chen. "Were you planning to coach her about assault too?" "Sir, I immediately suspended her. I called security. I was handling it according to protocol." "Your protocol?" Marcus's voice rose for the first time, allowed this woman to terrorize passengers for 3 years. Your protocol resulted in my 72-year-old mother being physically knocked to the ground. Your protocol is clearly insufficient. He turned to his head of legal affairs. Sandra, I want a full review of every complaint, every incident report, every passenger feedback form filed about this employee. I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning. And I want a review of every supervisor who saw those complaints and decided coaching was sufficient. Sandra nodded, already typing rapidly on her tablet. Marcus turned back to Jessica. You asked my mother if she knew who she was dealing with, if she knew who had the power here. He took a step closer. Do you know who you're dealing with? Jessica's face had gone gray. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. This airline, Marcus said, his voice quiet again but somehow more terrifying for its calmness, was built on a principle that every passenger, regardless of their race, their age, their economic status, their appearance, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. That principle came from my mother, from watching her be treated like she was less than human for most of her life, from seeing her hold her head high anyway, from learning that true strength isn't about power over others. It's about lifting others up. He pulled a slim wallet from his inside jacket pocket and extracted a card. Not a business card, an ID card. His airline ID, the one that identified him as the owner and CEO. I built this airline, Marcus said, holding the card up for everyone to see, so that my mother would never have to experience what she experienced growing up. So that no one's mother, no one's grandmother, no one's child would be treated like they don't belong in a public space because of the color of their skin. Around the terminal, passengers had gone completely silent. Phone cameras captured every word. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a reckoning. Jessica's legs seemed to give out. She sank into a nearby chair, her hands covering her face. I didn't know, she whispered through her fingers. I didn't know who she was. That's exactly the problem, Marcus said, his voice cutting through her excuses like a knife through butter. You should have treated her with respect because she's a human being, not because of who her son is, not because of what consequences you might face, because she deserves dignity. Every passenger who walks through these gates deserves dignity. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the terminal. I apologize to every person here who witnessed this. I apologize to every passenger who has ever been mistreated by any employee of this airline, and I promise you this ends today. Patricia, the gate agent, stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. Williams, sir, there's something else you should know. She held out her phone, showing Jessica's social media posts. These were public. I found them in about 30 seconds. Marcus took the phone, scrolling through the posts. With each one, his jaw tightened further. When he finally looked up, his eyes had gone cold in a way that made even the security officers shift uncomfortably. Terminate her employment immediately, he said to Chen. Not suspended. Terminated, for cause, no severance, no recommendations. And I want her banned from every Skybridge property worldwide. If she sets foot in any of our airports or on any of our aircraft as anything other than an escorted visitor under supervision, she'll be arrested for trespassing. You can't do that, Jessica said, her voice rising to a wail. You can't just destroy my career because of one mistake. I have rights. I have a union. You'll hear from my lawyer. Marcus's head of legal affairs spoke up for the first time. Ms. Hartley, your union contract has a clause about conduct unbecoming an airline representative. It has a clause about physical contact with passengers. And it has a very specific clause about discrimination. You violated all three. The union won't touch this case. No lawyer worth their license will touch this case. You assaulted a passenger on camera, and you did it for reasons that are documented on your own social media. You don't have a case, you have a liability. But what am I supposed to do? Jessica's voice had gone high and thin, almost childlike. This is all I know. I've worked here for 8 years. How am I supposed to pay my rent? What am I supposed to tell people? Margaret spoke for the first time since Marcus had arrived, her voice soft but clear. You tell them the truth. You tell them that you hurt someone and there were consequences, and then you spend the rest of your life learning to be better, because that's what grown-ups do when they make mistakes. The simple wisdom of it seemed to break something in Jessica. She started crying ugly, gulping sobs that shook her whole body, but no one moved to comfort her. No one offered sympathy, because everyone in that terminal understood that these were not tears of remorse. They were tears of consequence. Tears of someone who'd lived their entire life believing they were untouchable, that their prejudices were justified, that their actions didn't matter, suddenly discovering that the world didn't work the way they thought it did. Marcus helped his mother to her feet with infinite gentleness. "We're going to take you to the medical center, get you checked out properly. And then we're going to get you to Atlanta, though you'll be flying a bit more comfortably than you planned." "Marcus, I don't need first class," Margaret protested gently. "Mom," Marcus said, and his voice cracked again, "please, let me do this. Let me take care of you the way you always took care of me." Margaret smiled and patted her son's cheek. "Okay, baby, okay." As they began to walk toward the exit, supported by her son on one side and his executive assistant on the other, the passengers in the terminal began to applaud. It started with one person, then 2, then 5, then 20, until the entire gate area was filled with the sound of clapping. Some people were crying. Some were cheering. All of them understood they'd witnessed something important. But this story wasn't over yet. The medical center examination took 20 minutes. Margaret had deep bruising on her hip and some swelling in her wrist from catching herself during the fall. The doctor recommended rest, ice, and over-the-counter pain medication. He also documented everything thoroughly, taking photographs and making detailed notes at Marcus's quiet request. While Margaret was being examined, Marcus stood in the hallway making phone calls. His voice was calm, professional, but anyone standing close enough could hear the steel underneath. "I want every complaint filed against any employee in the past 5 years reviewed by an independent firm. I want new training protocols developed. I want our diversity and inclusion programs completely overhauled, and I want it done yesterday." He hung up and immediately dialed another number. "Get me the head of HR for the Western region. Yes, right now. I don't care if she's in a meeting. Tell her the CEO needs her immediately." By the time Margaret emerged from the examination room with a prescription and care instructions, Marcus had set in motion a series of changes that would reshape Skybridge Airline's entire corporate culture. But he wasn't done. "Mom," he said gently, "I need to go back to that gate. There's something I need to do. Will you be okay here with Sandra for a few minutes?" Margaret looked at her son's face and saw the determination there. She'd seen that expression before, when he was 12 years old and had stood up to a school bully who'd been tormenting a younger child. When he was 16 and had organized a sit-in at a local restaurant that refused to serve black customers. When he was 25 and had decided to start an airline from nothing because he believed he could do it better. "You do what you need to do," she said. "But baby, don't let anger make you cruel. That's not who we are." Marcus kissed his mother's forehead. "I learned from the best." He walked back to gate 47 with purpose, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the polished floors. Word had spread through the airport like wildfire. Staff members lined the corridors, their faces a mixture of concern, curiosity, and in some cases, shame. Several approached to apologize, to express their horror at what had happened. Marcus acknowledged each one with a nod but didn't stop walking. When he arrived back at the gate, he found Jessica still there, now flanked by 2 security officers and a woman in a business suit who was clearly a union representative. The union rep looked deeply uncomfortable. Jessica looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. But Marcus wasn't there for Jessica, not primarily. He walked to the center of the gate area, and without needing to say a word, every conversation stopped. Every eye turned to him. The passengers who'd witnessed the incident earlier were still there, unwilling to leave until they saw how this resolved. Others had heard what happened and come to watch. Gate 47 had become the center of the airport's attention. "My name is Margaret Williams," he said, his voice carrying clearly without shouting. "I'm the founder and CEO of Skybridge Airlines. About an hour ago, my mother was assaulted by one of my employees in this very spot. Some of you witnessed it. Many of you recorded it. All of you should know that I take full responsibility for the fact that this happened at all." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Admissions of responsibility from CEOs were rare things, usually filtered through PR teams and legal departments. When I started this airline 12 years ago, Marcus continued, I had a vision. I believed that air travel could be different, that it could be accessible, affordable, and most importantly, that it could treat every passenger with the dignity they deserve. I believed this because I watched my mother work 3 jobs to give her children opportunities. I watched her navigate a world that constantly told her she was less than, and I promised myself that I would build something better. He paused, looking around at all the faces watching him. I failed. I failed because I built systems that allowed a woman like Jessica Hartley to work here for 8 years while mistreating passengers of color. I failed because 17 complaints weren't enough to trigger real consequences. I failed because my protocols valued employee retention over passenger dignity, and my mother paid the price for my failure. Jessica made a small sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. The union representative put a hand on her shoulder, but Jessica shook it off. I'm not sorry, Jessica said suddenly, her voice sharp and brittle. Everyone keeps waiting for me to apologize, but I'm not sorry. You want to know why? Because I was doing my job. I was maintaining standards. I was keeping things orderly. And if that meant asking certain people to follow certain rules, then that's what I did. You're all acting like I'm some kind of monster, but I'm not. I'm just someone who believes in rules and order and standards. The crowd seemed to hold its breath. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, she's still going." Marcus turned to face Jessica fully, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. Ms. Hartley, do you understand what you just said? I said the truth, Jessica shot back, some of her earlier defiance returning. Everyone's too afraid to say it, but I'm not. Some people just don't belong in certain spaces. Some people need to learn their place. And if that makes me a monster in your eyes, then fine. I'm a monster, but at least I'm honest about it. The union representative closed her eyes as if in pain. The security officers exchanged glances that clearly said they wanted to be anywhere else. Marcus pulled out his phone and held it up. I'm recording this now, and I'm going to make sure everyone hears what you just said. Every airline in the country, every employer who might consider hearing you, every person who needs to understand that prejudice isn't always violent or loud. Sometimes it wears a uniform, sometimes it smiles while it hurts people. Sometimes it hides behind words like standards and order and belonging. He turned back to the crowd. Jessica Hartley will not work in aviation again. I will personally ensure that. But she's not the problem, not really. The problem is a system that allowed her to thrive. A system that saw complaints about her behavior and filed them away. A system that valued smooth operations over human dignity. And that system is what I'm going to change. He gestured to his head of legal affairs, who stepped forward with a document. Effective immediately, Skybridge Airlines is implementing what we're calling the Margaret Williams Protocol. Every complaint will be investigated by an independent review board. Every employee will undergo quarterly anti-discrimination training. Every passenger will have direct access to a complaint hotline that bypasses regional management. And every incident of discrimination will result in immediate termination. No exceptions, no second chances. The crowd erupted in applause again, but Marcus wasn't finished. More than that, we're establishing a fund. The Margaret Williams Dignity Fund, $10 million to start. It will provide free legal representation to any passenger who experiences discrimination on any airline, not just ours. It will support organizations fighting for civil rights. And it will ensure that what happened to my mother never happens to anyone else without there being resources to fight back. He looked directly at the cameras that were recording this moment. And I'm calling on every other airline in this industry to do the same, to admit that we have a problem, to acknowledge that passive diversity training isn't enough, to recognize that our industry was built on the backs of people who looked like my mother, and we owe them better. Marcus walked over to where the passengers who'd helped his mother were standing. He shook each of their hands personally. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for recording. Thank you for being the kind of people who see wrong and refuse to look away. The world needs more of you. To the businessman who'd offered his legal services, Marcus handed a business card. We're hearing civil rights attorneys for our new compliance division. If you're interested, call that number. We need people who know how to fight for what's right. Finally, he turned back to Jessica one last time. She stood there, her uniform rumpled, her face blotchy from crying, her career in ruins around her feet like broken glass. "Ms. Hartley," Marcus said, "I don't hate you, I pity you. Because you had a chance to be part of something good and you chose cruelty instead. You had power and you used it to hurt people, and now you have nothing. I hope someday you understand why. I hope someday you become the person who would be horrified by what you did today. But that's not my concern anymore. My concern is making sure no one like you ever has the power to hurt anyone in my airports again." He walked away without looking back, leaving Jessica standing there with her union representative, her terminated employment papers, and the full weight of her consequences settling over her like a shroud. 3 hours later, Margaret Williams sat in seat 1A of a Skybridge Airlines Boeing 787 Dreamliner, not because she was flying commercial, but because she'd insisted on it. Marcus had wanted to take her directly to Atlanta on his private jet, but Margaret had refused. "Baby," she'd said, "if I let this scare me away from flying regular like everyone else, then she wins. Then everyone like her wins. No, I'm going to get on that flight, and I'm going to hold my head high, and I'm going to show them that I belong in any space I choose to occupy." So Marcus had arranged for her to fly in first class on the next flight to Atlanta, which happened to be one he was scheduled to be on anyway for a meeting. He sat beside her now, holding her hand as the plane prepared for takeoff. Around them, the cabin crew moved with exceptional care and attention. Word had spread through the entire airline about what had happened. Every employee who came into contact with Margaret treated her with gentle respect, not because she was the CEO's mother, but because they were ashamed it had taken such an incident to wake up the organization to the problems that had festered in its culture. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer with warm eyes and 20 years of service, knelt beside Margaret's seat before takeoff. "Mrs. Williams," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, on behalf of everyone who works for this airline and actually believes in what it's supposed to stand for, that I'm sorry. I'm sorry that someone who wore the same uniform I wear hurt you. I'm sorry that the system failed you. And I promise you, a lot of us are going to work very hard to make sure it never happens again." Margaret took Jennifer's hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you, dear, but you don't need to apologize for someone else's actions. You just need to keep being the kind of person who would feel the need to apologize. That's what makes the difference." As the plane lifted off, climbing through clouds toward Atlanta, Margaret looked out the window at Denver shrinking below them. She thought about the long road that had brought her here. From Birmingham to Chicago, from segregation to success, from poverty to prosperity, from being told she didn't belong anywhere to raising a son who owned an airline. She thought about her mother, Ruth, who died 10 years ago but whose voice she still heard in quiet moments. "You're going to be somebody. You're going to change things." "I think I did, Mama," Margaret whispered to the window, to the sky, to the memory of the woman who'd given her the strength to endure. "I think we did." Beside her, Marcus was already on his laptop, working on the new protocols, the new training programs, the new oversight systems. He'd canceled his meetings for the next 3 days to personally oversee the implementation of the Margaret Williams protocol. He'd called the heads of 3 other major airlines and challenged them to join him in reforming the industry. 2 had already agreed. The businessman who'd recorded everything had sent the videos to multiple news outlets. By the time Margaret's flight landed in Atlanta, the story was viral. Jessica Hartley's face was on every news channel, identified as an example of discrimination that still persisted in America. The videos had been viewed 15 million times. Hashtags were trending: Black Excellence, End Airline Discrimination, Margaret Williams. But more importantly, the comment sections were full of stories. Thousands upon thousands of people sharing their own experiences, their own moments of being told they didn't belong, their own incidents of being profiled, questioned, humiliated, pushed. And many of them were ending their stories with, "But not anymore, not again. We're not staying silent anymore." 3 major airlines announced new anti-discrimination policies within 24 hours. 5 more followed within a week. Congress announced hearings on discrimination in the airline industry. The FAA issued new guidance on passenger rights and employee conduct. Jessica Hartley became a cautionary tale. Her social media posts were dissected by trainers and consultants as examples of how prejudice hides in plain sight. Her actions became case studies in HR departments. Her name became synonymous with the kind of behavior that organizations could no longer ignore or excuse. But she also became a symbol of something else, of consequences, of accountability, of the fact that the world was changing and those who refused to change with it would be left behind. 2 weeks after the incident, Margaret stood at her granddaughter's college graduation, watching with pride as the young woman accepted her diploma. The pound cake had survived the journey, shared among family members who'd gathered to celebrate. And when her granddaughter gave her valedictorian speech, she spoke about dignity, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. "My grandmother," she said, her voice carrying across the graduation ceremony, "taught me that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you unless you give it away. And she taught me that by example, by living with grace through decades of indignity, by holding her head high when others tried to push it down, by being in every moment a testament to the power of quiet strength." The audience, who'd seen the viral videos, who knew the story, rose to their feet in applause. Margaret sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, her son beside her, and felt the weight of 72 years of struggle transform into something else. Not vindication, not victory, just the simple, profound satisfaction of knowing that her life had mattered, that her pain had purpose, that her dignity, maintained through every insult and injury, had taught her children and grandchildren how to walk through the world with their heads held high. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret smiled through her tears. "Baby, I'm more than okay. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." That evening at the family celebration dinner, Margaret's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Jennifer, the flight attendant who'd apologized. She'd attached a photo of the entire cabin crew from Margaret's flight holding a banner that read, "We stand with Margaret Williams. We choose dignity." Below the photo was a message, "You changed us, thank you." Margaret showed the photo to her family, and her daughter Sandra hugged her tight. "Mama, do you realize what you've done? You've changed an entire industry." "No," Margaret said gently. "I just stood in my truth. It was everyone else, everyone who recorded, everyone who spoke up, everyone who demanded better. They're the ones who made the change. I was just the spark. They were the fire." But she was wrong about that, and everyone who knew her understood it. Margaret Williams wasn't just a spark. She was the embodiment of every black woman who'd been told to sit down, shut up, know her place, and had instead stood tall. She was the continuation of her mother's dreams and the foundation of her children's success. She was 72 years of dignity in the face of indignity, grace in the face of cruelty, strength in the face of oppression. She was, in every sense that mattered, exactly what her mother had promised she would be, somebody who changed things. And as she sat surrounded by her family, in the city where she'd come to watch her granddaughter graduate, in a country that was slowly, painfully learning to live up to its promises of equality and justice, Margaret Williams closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel something she'd rarely permitted: pride. Pride in herself, pride in her children, pride in everyone who'd stood up that day in Gate 47 and refused to look away from injustice. Pride in the knowledge that the world her grandchildren would inherit would be, even in small increments, better than the one she'd grown up in. Outside the restaurant window, planes rose into the Atlanta sky, carrying people to destinations around the world. And on every Skybridge Airlines flight, in every gate area, at every check-in counter, new protocols were in effect. New training was being conducted. New accountability was being enforced. The aviation industry would never be perfect. Discrimination wouldn't end overnight. But because one elderly black woman had refused to be erased, refused to be silent, refused to accept that she deserved anything less than dignity, thousands of other people would travel a little bit safer, a little bit more respected, a little bit more human. And that, Margaret thought as she raised her glass to toast her granddaughter's future, was worth every single difficult moment of the past 72 years. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more.